The morning Wren Ashby arrived at Caldwell House, she counted 11 rooms that had been hers since birth. One orchard her mother had planted the summer she was pregnant, and one Earl who handed her a coal bucket at the door without bothering to learn her name. She took it. She had her reasons. The carriage that brought her from the coaching inn at Harwick was not the kind her family had kept. It was borrowed, narrow, and smelled of damp wool. This was deliberate. Wren had dressed with the same care she brought to everything, not poorly, but without distinction. A dark brown traveling dress, worn at the cuffs, hair pinned simply. No earrings, no brooch, no rings except the small one on her right hand that had been her mother's, worn with the stone turned inward against her palm where no one could see it. She had looked at herself in the mirror of the inn that morning and thought, yes, that will do. Caldwell House appeared through the birch trees at 8:30. She had not seen it in 4 years. She had last stood on this drive, holding a solicitor's letter she did not fully understand, and watching the gates close behind her uncle's carriage. And she had made herself a promise that day that she intended to keep. The birch trees were the same. Everything else felt occupied. The woman who met her at the servants' entrance was the housekeeper, Mrs. Penhaligon, a composed woman in her 60s, whose eyes moved over Wren with the quick, professional assessment of someone who sorted people rapidly and rarely reversed her judgments. Wren let her look. She gave her name as Miss Wren Ashby and said she had come in answer to the advertisement for a house assistant to the Countess Dowager. Mrs. Penhaligon said the position was still available, that the Countess received visitors at 10, and that she would be shown to her room presently. They were crossing the rear hall when the door to the estate office opened. He was not what she had expected, though she was not certain what she had expected. The Earl of Caldwell was 36, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to move through rooms without filling them unnecessarily. He was carrying a set of account ledgers. He was also, without looking up, walking directly toward the place where Wren was standing. Mrs. Penhaligon stepped aside, with the trained instinct of long service. Wren stood still. The Earl stopped. He looked at Mrs. Penhaligon first, not at Wren, and said, "The ash bin in the east corridor hasn't been cleared since Tuesday. The smell is coming through the sitting-room wall." His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who expected things to be done and found it mildly inconvenient when they weren't. Mrs. Penhaligon said, "I'll see to it, my lord." Then the Earl's gaze moved briefly to Wren. He took her in the way one notes a piece of furniture, present, catalogued, categorically assigned. His expression did not shift. He turned back through the office door, then paused, reached to the side table just inside, and produced a coal bucket, not empty, the kind that needed emptying, ash-gray and handled with the ease of a man who had done this handoff before, and held it out in Wren's direction, not rudely, not unkindly, simply. There was a task. There was a person available for tasks. The logic was complete. Wren looked at the bucket. She thought of 11 rooms. She thought of the orchard. She thought of the stone turned inward against her palm. She took the bucket. The Earl was already walking down the corridor, ledgers under his arm. Mrs. Penhaligon watched him go, then turned to Wren with an expression that was not unkind, but not apologetic either. Wren held the ash bucket and said nothing. "I'll show you your room," Mrs. Penhaligon said. "Thank you," Wren said. "That would be kind." She followed the housekeeper through the servants' passage and up the back stair, bucket in hand, and did not look at the rooms she passed. She did not need to. She knew this house the way she knew her own breathing, which stair creaked, which latch stuck, which window in the west wing had never properly sealed and let in a thread of wind every November that her mother had complained about cheerfully every year without ever having it fixed. The room Mrs. Penhaligon showed her was small and faced the kitchen garden. Wren set the bucket by the door, removed her coat, and went to the window. Below, the herb beds were neglected. The lavender her mother had kept along the south edge had grown woody and untrimmed. Someone had attempted to plant something near the gate and given up partway through. Wren pressed her hand to the glass and looked for a moment. Then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and reached into her traveling coat. In the inner pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, was her father's letter. She had read it 6 times. She knew what it said. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it on the bed, stood, and picked up the ash bucket. She might as well do what needed doing. She had time. She was in no hurry at all. She emptied the bucket. She did it without being asked twice, without comment, without anything that might mark her as other than what she appeared to be. She returned it to the east corridor passage before noon, placed it exactly where it had been, and went to find Mrs. Penhaligon for the outline of her duties. She was to attend the Countess Dowager, the Earl's mother, who kept to the east wing, and managed what Mrs. Penhaligon described as a great deal of correspondence and a great many opinions. She was to be available for reading aloud in the afternoons. She was to take her meals in the housekeeper's parlor. She was to remain unobtrusive. Wren said she understood. She spent her first full day relearning the house, not because she had forgotten it, but because she needed to know what had changed and what hadn't. The third stair from the top of the east flight still groaned. The door to the library still required lifting slightly at the handle before it would close. The light in the gallery at the top of the main stair still did something particular at 4 in the afternoon. Something gold and angled that she remembered without having tried to remember it, and when she walked into it on that first day she stopped for 1 second, only one, before she made herself move on. No one saw. What was different? The study off the west hall, which had been her father's room for 30 years, now held the Earl's work. New furnishings, different smell, wood oil and cold pipe smoke rather than her father's preference for open windows even in winter. Wren stood in the doorway on the pretense of delivering a message from the Countess and looked at it for as long as was natural, and then walked away. The harder thing was the garden. On her second morning she crossed the rear lawn, and the old groundskeeper was there. His name was Mr. Solly, and he had been at Caldwell House since before Wren was born. He was, perhaps 70 now, and moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who had decided his joints were entitled to their opinion. He had taught Wren the names of every apple variety in the orchard when she was 8. He had let her climb the oldest tree and pretended not to notice when she got stuck. When Mr. Solly looked up from his work and saw her crossing the lawn, he went very still. He stood that way for a moment. Then he removed his hat, not a nod, not the brief acknowledgement of one household member passing another. He removed his hat and held it to his chest in the particular way of a man paying a debt of respect he had been holding in trust. Wren met his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head, the barest movement. Not yet. Mr. Solly replaced his hat. "Morning, miss," he said, in exactly the voice of a groundskeeper greeting a house assistant, and went back to his work. That evening, on the windowsill of her small room, there was an apple. A Cox's orange from the old tree. She knew the variety before she picked it up. It had been placed there without ceremony or note. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on her writing table and did not permit herself to cry. She had made an agreement with herself on that subject, and she intended to honor it. The cook, whose name was Mrs. Tavish, had been at Caldwell House 12 years, and ran the kitchen with the friendly authority of a woman who had outlasted several earls and expected to outlast several more. She had not known Wren's family directly. She had arrived after. On her third morning, Wren came down to collect the Countess Dowager's breakfast tray and found it set with the good china, and a pot of the expensive Ceylon blend kept locked in the pantry, 2 soft rolls with the good butter, and a small dish of preserved apricots that Mrs. Tavish produced only for guests of consequence. Wren looked at the tray. "Mrs. Tavish," she said carefully, "I believe this may be for the Countess's table rather than mine." "That's yours," said Mrs. Tavish pleasantly, without turning from the range. "I'm the house assistant," Wren said. "I take my meals in." "You take what I give you," said Mrs. Tavish, in the tone of a woman who has ended discussions with that sentence before and will end them again, and turned around with an expression that dared Wren to continue. Wren took the tray. She did not ask how Mrs. Tavish knew. Old houses had their own circulation of information. Slow, invisible, but thorough. The house knew her. She had not fully prepared for that, and it moved her considerably more than she had expected. It also made her careful. She became aware of the Earl's attention on the fourth day. She was in the gallery above the main stair, moving slowly through it under the pretense of dusting. When she looked down and found him standing in the hall below, entirely still, watching her with an expression she could not read from that angle, not suspicion, more the expression of a man who has placed something into a category, and then encountered evidence that the category may have been premature. She descended the stair at her usual pace. He was still there at the bottom. "You were looking at the portrait," he said, without preamble. Wren turned. On the wall to her left, half covered by a length of cloth, the color of old curtain, was a portrait. She had not let herself look at it directly since arriving. She had been careful. But she had been walking the gallery, and the gallery was where it had always hung, and he had apparently been watching her more closely than she had realized. The cloth covered the lower half. The upper portion, a woman's face, dark hair, a certain angle to the jaw, was visible above the fold. Wren's hands had stilled slightly before she could prevent it. "I noticed the frame," she said. "The gilding is very fine." He looked at her. He quite clearly did not believe her, and he quite clearly did not know what he believed instead, and the uncertainty sat on him with the visible discomfort of a man accustomed to legible situations. "The portrait is covered," he said, "as the subject is no longer relevant to the household." "Of course," Wren said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked on. Wren stood in the gallery alone. She looked at the visible portion of the portrait above the cloth, the angle of the jaw, the particular way the painted figure held her head, as if the room belonged to her, as if it had never occurred to her that it might not. Wren reached out and touched the edge of the frame, just once. "Soon," she said, not aloud. "To the portrait, to the house, to the 11 rooms that already knew her name." She straightened and walked on. That evening she sat at the writing table in her room and looked at her father's letter without reading it. She knew his handwriting the way she knew the creak of that third stair, by feel, in the dark, without needing to look. He had been a careful man, the kind of man who understood that the only reliable protection against people who want what you have is documentation they cannot dispute. He had planned for this. She had to trust that. The document room was off the West Hall, 2 doors from the estate office. She had walked past it 4 times. She knew what she was looking for and approximately where it would be if her uncle had not already found it. She did not think he had. He was a man who moved in straight lines, and her father had been a man who thought in depth. She calculated, perhaps 10 days before her uncle's next visit to the house. The Countess had mentioned it without knowing. Wren was listening for exactly that information. 10 days was sufficient. She folded the letter, put out the candle, and listened to the house settle around her in the dark. His name was Aldrich Voss. She had known it from the legal correspondence she had read before leaving her lodgings in Halifax, from the dry and bloodless documents that describe the temporary guardianship of the Caldwell estate in language that managed to make injustice sound administrative. Aldrich Voss, second Earl of Caldwell, 36 years old, unmarried, had inherited the title through a distant lateral line when the previous Earl, Wren's father, had died without a recognized male heir. The house had passed to him while Wren's claim was still being disputed. The dispute had gone badly. Her uncle, her father's brother, had managed that. She did not think of him as Aldrich. She thought of him as the Earl, which kept the shape of things clear in her mind. He was not, she had decided, a villain. She had met her uncle, and she knew what that looked like. The Earl was something more difficult, a man of ordinary assumptions and considerable legal authority who had inherited a situation he had not created and was making decisions based on information that had been carefully curated against her. She revised her assessment slightly at the end of her first week. A neighbor came for dinner, a Mr. Tulloch, broad and confident, the kind of man who moved through rooms as though they had been arranged for him specifically. He was seated at the dining table when Wren was required to pass through the room on an errand for the Countess. She moved as she had learned to move through this house, present, necessary, undemanding of attention. She was nearly to the far door when Mr. Tulloch noticed her. "Who's this, then?" he said in the tone of a man commenting on something mildly entertaining. Wren stopped. She turned. She said nothing. "Come here," Mr. Tulloch said pleasantly. Wren did not move. She was quite good at not moving. The pleasant quality in Mr. Tulloch's expression adjusted slightly. "I said, come here." "I heard you," Wren said. Her voice was polite. It was always polite. "I have an errand for the Countess that won't keep. Please forgive me." She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, Mr. Tulloch made a sound of amused offense. She caught one word, remarkable, deployed in a tone that did not mean remarkable, and then she heard the Earl's voice, even and unhurried, cut across whatever followed. "The Mersey contract has those penalty clauses you were asking about. I had them drawn up last month. A clean redirect, complete." Wren paused in the doorway for a fraction of a second. Then she continued through. She stood in the corridor and allowed herself to be surprised. Not dramatically. A small internal revision, filed away with everything else she was filing. It did not change her plan, but it changed the shape of the Earl slightly in her mind. He was not indifferent to everything. Then he was selective. The question was what drove the selection. She found out more that week. The Countess, Lady Emmeline Voss, the Earl's mother, was not unkind. She was nervous and discursive, and had a great deal to say about the inadequacy of the previous house assistant. But she was not unkind, and she had taken to Wren with the warmth of a woman who is lonely enough to be grateful, and perceptive enough to recognize that Wren was more than she appeared. Without being curious enough to ask why, she talked. Wren listened, and in listening she learned a great deal. She learned that the Earl had been engaged, some years prior, to a Miss Harriet Frome, a match considered suitable by both families. She learned that this engagement had ended under circumstances Lady Emmeline described as deeply regrettable, with an expression that suggested she had a great many opinions she had been advised to keep private. She learned that her son had come back from his year in Edinburgh, managing the northern properties he'd inherited alongside Caldwell, quieter than he had left, and that this quietness worried his mother in ways she could not articulate beyond repeating the word quiet at intervals. She also learned, incidentally, that Wren's uncle, Mr. Wren Ashby, had visited Caldwell House 3 times since the estate had come into the Earl's management and was expected before the end of the fortnight. Wren had already known this. Confirmed, it sharpened the calculation in her chest. She had 9 days. On the 8th day, she went into the document room. She had studied the lock on her second morning. She had noted the key on Mrs. Penhaligon's ring that did not correspond to any door she had mapped. Mrs. Penhaligon's keys hung in the housekeeper's parlor each night from 9:30. Mrs. Penhaligon slept deeply. Wren had established this through the simple method of listening. She did not take the key. She borrowed it for 14 minutes and returned it before the clock in the lower hall had finished striking 10. What she did in those 14 minutes was move through the document room by candlelight, with the systematic precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking for and where her father would have put it. His letter had been specific. In the room where the estate records are kept, behind the wainscoting to the left of the chimney breast, there is a space that was part of the original construction. Your grandfather knew about it. I know about it. You will know because I am telling you now. The panel was where he had described. The space was behind it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth as her father always wrapped important things, was an envelope. She did not open it in the document room. She replaced the panel, returned the key, and carried the envelope back to her room inside her coat. She lay in the dark for some time looking at the ceiling, her hand resting flat against the place where the envelope was, and allowed herself to feel, carefully and fully, something that might have been the first real breath she'd taken in 4 years. She opened it before dawn. 3 things: her father's will, witnessed and signed with the precise legality of a man who had anticipated opposition, a letter from the family solicitor in Halifax confirming the will's filing date and validity, and a note in her father's handwriting that said only, "I knew you'd find it. The house has always been yours. It has always known it too." She read the note 3 times, then she folded everything back into the oilcloth, placed the envelope in her inner coat pocket, and went down to help with the morning. Mrs. Tavish gave her the good tea without being asked. Mr. Solly came in from the kitchen garden and looked at Wren's face with the accuracy of a man who had known her family for 40 years, and gave one slow, deliberate nod. Wren nodded back. The days that followed were the most careful she had yet navigated. Her uncle arrived on a Thursday. She had been watching from the Countess's window and saw the carriage come through the birch trees. His name was Wren Ashby, and he had the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into warmth and concern, which Wren had learned by the age of 15 was the most dangerous face a dishonest man could have. He was 61 now, well dressed in the way of men who need to appear more settled than they are. She did not go to the entrance hall. She stayed at her post. She watched from the upper landing as he was received below, hat taken, coat taken, hand extended to the Earl with the practiced ease of a man, presenting himself as an indispensable ally. And she watched her uncle's eyes move over the entrance hall with the quick, possessive assessment of a man reminding himself of what he intended to gain. She went back to the Countess and picked up her needlework. She had 8 days. She moved through the next several days with the focused calm of someone carrying something fragile in rough weather. Her uncle was charming at the table. She heard him through the wall of the dining room, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man performing for an audience he believed wholly won over. He was working on the Earl. She could hear it in the rhythm of their exchanges, the way he circled and redirected, establishing himself as the reasonable interpreter of an unreasonable situation. She understood the shape of his plan more clearly 3 days into his visit, when she paused outside the estate office. The door had never closed properly. She had known this since she was 12, and heard her own name. "Miss Ashby," her uncle was saying, in the tone of a man sharing something that caused him personal pain. "I feel it is only right to speak plainly, my lord, as she is in residence here. I have tried, genuinely tried, to assist my niece. But there is a history of difficulty, an instability. She has made claims before, about property, about her circumstances, that have proven to be without foundation. I say this as a man who has a genuine concern for her welfare. If she has said anything to you regarding the estate, she has said very little to me," the Earl said. "About anything." "Good," her uncle's voice settled. "I am relieved. I only raise it because the legal process is quite settled, and I would not wish any confusion to arise from allegations she might make. She is my brother's daughter. I am fond of her, but she is not well." Wren stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. Then she continued walking, because standing still longer would have required her to decide what to do with her hands, and she was not ready to make that decision. She delivered the Countess's letter. She came back. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and placed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the window and worked on her breathing until it became ordinary again. She had expected this. She had always known it was coming. Her uncle had spent 4 years building this, ensuring that any claim she brought would arrive already discredited. She had known, and yet hearing it said in her father's house to a man who she had noticed this, had filed it carefully, begun to see her as something other than furniture, produced in her chest a cold and very specific anger that she had not fully prepared for. She breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when the knock came at her door. Firm, unhurried, the knock of a man who did not doubt he would be admitted. She stood and opened it. The Earl stood in the corridor. His expression was the controlled neutral one she had catalogued. Underneath it, something had shifted. "Your uncle tells me," he said, without greeting, "that you have made claims of this nature before, claims without foundation." Wren looked at him. She felt the anger in her chest, cold and contained. "Did he show you my father's will?" she said. The Earl said nothing. "Not a summary," she continued, "not a copy. The original document with my father's signature and the solicitor's seal. Did he show you that?" Silence. "My lord," Wren said, and something had entered her voice that had not been there before. Not heat, not desperation, but a quality of complete steadiness that was perhaps more striking than either. "You are in the process of making a decision about a significant piece of property. Before you make it, I would like to ask you one question, and I would like you to answer it honestly." He waited. "In all your dealings with Wren Ashby regarding this estate," she said, "have you ever seen the original will?" "Not a copy. The original." The Earl held her gaze. Something moved behind his expression. Not belief, not disbelief, the particular look of a man who has just realized their question should have asked some time ago and did not think to ask. He did not answer. He did not need to. "Thank you," Wren said quietly. "That is what I thought." She began to close the door. He put one hand flat against it, not forcefully, just enough. "Miss Ashby," he said. She waited. He seemed to be working something out. Then, "Be careful." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of belief. It was 2 words in a low, level tone that communicated, with minimal efficiency, that whatever he was calculating had not resolved itself, but that she should not go anywhere alone after dark. Wren looked at his hand on her door. She looked at his face. "I have been careful," she said, "for quite some time." She did not close the door again. He removed his hand and walked back down the corridor, and she watched him go, and she stood in the doorway of the narrow room in her father's house, and felt the cold anger settle into something harder and quieter, something that would last. She heard the sound at 10:30, from the end of the West Hall. Quiet, deliberate, the sound of a person moving through a room they have no right to be in, the document room. She was out of bed before the thought finished. She pulled her coat over her nightgown, lit the candle on the nightstand with steady hands, and walked to the end of the West Hall. The document room door was ajar. The lock was open. She pushed it and walked in. Her uncle stood on the far side of the room with a lamp, the wainscoting panel pulled away from the wall, staring at the empty space behind it. When he turned and saw her in the doorway, coat, candle, completely still, his face moved through several expressions before it settled on the one he had decided to use. "My dear," he said with the warm sorrow of a man grieved by what he was witnessing. "What are you doing here?" "I was worried. You heard nothing from this room," Wren said. The hall does not carry sound. You came because you had already come once before and found nothing, and you came again because you hoped I had not yet collected it." He stopped. She looked at the empty space behind his panel. She looked at his face. "It isn't there," she said. Her voice was entirely even. "Whatever you came for isn't there anymore." Her uncle went very still. "I think," Wren said quietly, "that you should go to bed." She held the door open. After a long moment, he walked past her into the corridor without a word. His lamp threw his shadow long against the wall. She watched him go. She waited until his footsteps had fully receded. Then she went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, placed one hand over the envelope inside her coat, and held it there in the dark. 7 days. She could do 7 days. The morning after the document room, her uncle came to breakfast in the housekeeper's parlor, where Wren took her meals, which was not where he usually ate, which meant the conversation she had hoped to delay was apparently happening now. She sat down. She poured her tea. She waited. He watched her with the expression he had settled on since the previous night, no longer the warm sorrow which she had refused, but something more measured. He was recalibrating. He did it constantly, and it was the closest thing to honesty she had ever observed in him. "You have something," he said. "Good morning, Uncle Lachlan," Wren said. "Don't." The warmth left his voice completely. "You have something. I want to know what." "I have my tea," Wren said pleasantly. "Which is very good. Mrs. Tavish has a remarkable hand with it." He set his cup down. "You were a stubborn child," he said. "Your father found it charming. I did not." "I know," Wren said. "I remember that clearly." They looked at each other across the table with the particular honesty of two people who have decided, without stating it, to stop performing. "Whatever you think you have," he said, "it will not hold. I have spent 4 years ensuring that any claim you make arrives already discredited. The legal process is settled. You are a young woman with no standing and a documented history of instability, which I have taken considerable care to establish. Whatever document you believe exists." 4 years, Wren said. He paused. "You said 4 years." She tilted her head very slightly. "My father was ill for 2 years before he died. You began before he was gone." Her uncle said nothing. "I know," Wren said, simply, without heat, the way one states a fact that has been known a long time and requires nothing further. "I have known for quite a while. I want you to understand that clearly, not so you feel caught, but so we do not waste time on pretending." She stood, smoothed her coat, picked up her cup. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said. "I believe you are expected in the estate office at 9. I would use the time before then to think carefully about what you intend to say." She left him at the table. The days that followed were a kind of sustained delicacy she had not previously experienced. She was carrying the most important piece of paper she had ever held against her ribs every waking hour. She was living in her own house under a false pretense. Her uncle was 3 doors down, working on the Earl, and the deadline, the condition in her father's will that she must present her claim in person before a legal witness within 18 months of his death, expired in 6 days. She needed a solicitor, or a commissioner of oaths, or someone with the legal standing to formally receive her claim. She needed this in 6 days. She needed it before her uncle realized what was happening. She was running through the logistics of this on the morning of the 5th day, when the footman found her in the east corridor with a message. The Earl would like to see her in the library at her convenience. She went. He was standing at the tall window when she entered. He turned. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept particularly well. She could not entirely blame him. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was intentional, the positioning of a man who wanted to retain some sense of order over a situation he was increasingly aware he did not fully understand. He was quiet for a moment. She let him be quiet. She had observed that the Earl's silences were working silences. He was thinking, and he thought better without interruption. "Your uncle came to me again this morning," he said finally. "I expected he would. He told me that you are." He paused. "Unstable, that any document you might produce should be treated with significant skepticism. That the claim is settled and straightforward." "Yes," Wren said. "He has been building that case for 4 years. It is quite a thorough construction." The Earl moved away from the window. He did not sit. He stood near the chair across from her and looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging since the 4th day, the one that sat underneath his usual composure, like something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "He also told me," the Earl said, more slowly, "that you were in the document room last night." "We were both in the document room last night," Wren said. "He arrived first." A pause. What was he looking for? "The same thing I found 5 days ago." The silence that followed was different from the working silences she had filed. It was the silence of a man reorganizing several things at once. "You found something," he said, "5 days ago." "Yes," and said nothing. She met his gaze. "I was waiting," she said, "to understand what kind of man you were." The Earl was quiet for a moment. Then, with a directness that was, she had come to understand, his form of genuine inquiry. "And have you?" Wren looked at him. At the set of his shoulders, the careful control of his expression, the particular way he had positioned himself in the room, close enough to be direct, far enough to give her space. She had observed that this spatial courtesy was characteristic of him. She doubted he was aware he extended it. She thought about Mr. Tulloch and the redirect. She thought about "be careful," 2 words delivered in a corridor. She thought about the fact that she had been in this house for nearly 2 weeks and had not once seen him be cruel. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a man who moves quickly on incomplete information and who finds it genuinely uncomfortable to revise. I think you were given a situation you did not create and have been managing it with the information available to you, which has been deliberately limited. I think you are not my uncle's instrument, which was not something I was certain of when I arrived." The Earl considered this for a moment. "That is not entirely a compliment." "No," Wren agreed, "but it is what I think." He sat down then, not in the formal way, but leaning slightly forward with his elbows on his knees, which was not how an Earl usually sat. It was honest, she thought. The posture of a man who had decided to stop maintaining a particular performance. "Show me," he said. Wren reached into her coat. She had moved the envelope closer that morning. She had been moving it closer each day as the deadline approached. She placed it on the table between them. The Earl looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he knows will rearrange things, taking one final moment before the rearranging begins. Then he picked it up and read. He read slowly. She appreciated that. It meant he was actually reading. She watched his face and saw the exact moment he reached the conditional clause in the will. Something in the line of his jaw changed. He read the solicitor's letter. He read her father's note last. He was quiet for a long time when he finished. He set the documents down with care. "Why didn't you simply tell me," he said, "when you arrived?" She had prepared an answer for this. A measured, reasonable answer. She did not give it. "Because I needed to know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she had intended, "what you would do with the power to destroy me before I handed it to you." He said nothing. "My uncle has spent 4 years ensuring my word alone is worth nothing," she continued. "If I had walked in on the first day and told you who I was and shown you this document, you would have had 2 choices, believe me or believe him. And you had no reason to believe me, none at all. So I watched. I needed to understand whether you were the kind of man who would use what I gave you against me." She paused. "I have known men who would." The Earl was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the neutrality, not the assessment. Something that had less protection in it. "The bucket," he said. His voice was different. "Yes," Wren said. He stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not rest but effort. "The deadline," he said. 6 days. He turned around. "I need to go to Halifax. I know. Tonight." "Yes." He looked at her across the library, her father's library, the room where she had learned to read, where the shelves on the bottom row had been arranged at child height on purpose, where the faint mark on the wainscoting near the door was from a pot of ink she had knocked over at age 10 that had apparently survived every subsequent cleaning. "The will is legitimate," he said. "I am not questioning it. I know you're not. Your uncle will challenge it regardless." He paused. "There may be complications on my end. My position in this, the legal entanglement of the inheritance, I need to speak to my own solicitor first, but—" He stopped, seemed to be deciding how much to say. "What you need is a witness. Someone whose standing cannot be easily challenged," Wren said. "I am an Earl." It was a statement of practical fact, not declaration. "My testimony is not easily dismissed." Wren said nothing. "I'll ride tonight," he said. "You'll come with me. We'll reach Halifax by morning and be at your solicitor's office before they can stop us." He picked up the documents from the table and held them out to her. "Keep these on your person." Wren took them. She looked at them in her hands. She looked at him. "Why?" she said, not suspiciously, genuinely. He seemed briefly thrown by the directness of it. "Because it is the right thing to do." A pause. "And because I handed you an ash bucket." Wren looked at him for a moment. "My coat is missing a button," she said. "Should I find one first?" The Earl blinked. "I am joking," Wren said. She stood, replaced the documents carefully inside her coat, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "My lord," she said. He looked at her. "My father's note," she said, the short one at the bottom of the envelope. "I would like it returned when this is finished." "Of course," he said. She nodded and left. In the corridor, she walked 6 steps, stopped, placed one hand flat against the wall of her father's house, and breathed. Then she went upstairs to pack. They left at 9:30. Wren came down to the rear gate with her coat and a small traveling bag and found the Earl already there with 2 horses and no carriage. He looked at the bag, then at the horses, and said with the economy of a man who had made a decision and was not revisiting it, "We'll make better time. Can you ride?" "I grew up on this estate," Wren said. He accepted this without comment and helped her mount with the impersonal efficiency of a practical man performing a practical function. They went out through the back lane that ran along the eastern boundary, away from the main drive, away from anyone watching, from the house. Wren had ridden this lane as a child. In the dark, with the smell of the October fields around her and the sound of hooves on packed ground, she felt the particular displacement of a known place seen in the wrong light. Same structure, different feeling, like a face you love seen in grief. They did not speak much for the first hour. The Earl rode slightly ahead on the narrow sections. Wren watched the set of his back and thought about the library and the documents, and what it meant that a man she had arrived, intending to observe from a careful distance, was now riding beside her in the dark toward a city, where she intended to claim everything her father had left her. At a coaching inn past midnight, they stopped to rest the horses. The Earl came back from the counter with tea and bread and set them on the table without asking. They sat across from each other in the empty front room. "Your uncle will know by morning," the Earl said. "Yes, he'll go to the house first, find you gone, and then come to Mrs. Penhaligon." Wrapped her hands around her cup. Wren wrapped her hands around her cup. "Mrs. Penhaligon will tell him she's honest and he will press her." "She might not," the Earl said, in a tone suggesting he knew his housekeeper rather better than his housekeeper suspected. She might not, Wren allowed, but he will assume Halifax regardless. He'll send a rider. He won't overtake us, but he will be behind us when we arrive, the Earl said. Which means the filing must be completed before noon. Do you understand the urgency of noon? I understood the urgency of noon before we left, the Earl said, with a dryness that caught her off guard enough that she nearly smiled. They reached Halifax as the city was coming gray out of the dark. Wren knew it well. She had lived there for 2 years in a set of rented rooms near the waterfront, while she saved and planned and waited for the moment to arrive. She knew the solicitor's office on Argyle Street. She had sat across from Mr. Ferris Dodd twice before, had placed her father's letter in front of that small, careful man, and had watched him read it with the attentiveness of someone who takes the measure of a case slowly and commits to it thoroughly. He had said, "When you are ready, come to me." She had written 3 days ago. There had been no reply. Either the letter had not reached him yet, or he had had no time to answer. They arrived at 8. Mr. Dodd was there. He opened the door himself and looked at Wren with the expression of a man who had been waiting, and then looked past her at the Earl with an expression that required rapid revision of several things at once. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Mr. Dodd," Wren said. "This is the Earl of Caldwell. He is here as a witness." Mr. Dodd looked at the Earl for another moment. Then he stood back from the door. "Come in," he said. What followed was nearly 2 hours of careful, thorough legal work. Mr. Dodd read every document twice. He asked Wren questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable about dates and circumstances and the specific chain of witnesses to her father's signature. Wren answered all of them with the accuracy of someone who has been preparing for this conversation for a long time. The Earl sat in the corner and said nothing, unless addressed, and when addressed, answered with the directness of a man who understood that his presence in the room was doing its work without embellishment. At one point, Mr. Dodd looked over his spectacles and said, "You are prepared to provide a signed statement confirming your presence, and that you observed no irregularity in the presentation of this document?" "I am," the Earl said, "and to stand behind that statement if it is challenged." "Mr. Dodd," the Earl said, with a patience that had a very thin edge beneath it, "I have ridden through the night and answered your questions for the better part of an hour. I am prepared." Mr. Dodd accepted this with a small, satisfied nod and returned to his work. At 20 minutes before noon, Wren signed her name to the formal claim. Mr. Dodd signed below it. The Earl signed as witness. Mr. Dodd pressed his seal into the wax with the gravity of a man who understands the weight of a moment. "It is done, Miss Ashby," he said. "The claim is properly filed. The estate is yours." Wren looked at her name on the document, at her father's name above it, at the seal. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something. They were back on Argyle Street at noon exactly. Wren stood on the pavement in the gray Halifax morning and breathed the harbor-cold air and felt something shift in her chest that she had no precise word for. Not triumph, not relief. Something older and quieter. Something that had to do with her father and her mother and the orchard, and a portrait half covered in the gallery at Caldwell House. The Earl stood beside her. He was looking at the street with the expression of a man who has completed one thing and is already assessing what comes next. "It will be challenged," he said. "Yes, immediately and thoroughly. But the deadline is met." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a slight effort, as if the words required assembly, "I owe you more than an apology for the bucket." Wren looked at him. Away from the house, away from the structure of household and title that both of them had been performing, he looked. "I found this unexpected. Tired. Not weak. Simply a man who had ridden through the night and was standing on a pavement in the cold with honest fatigue on him and an honest thing to say. "You owe me nothing," she said. He turned to look at her. "You owe me nothing," she said again, more gently. You came when it was needed. You signed what needed signing. That is," she stopped. "That is more than I had any right to expect." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she did not examine too closely because she was tired and the morning was already carrying enough weight. "We should eat," he said, "before we ride back." "Yes," she said. They found a place near the waterfront and ate a proper meal for the first time in over a day. They talked about nothing consequential, about Halifax in the morning, about the harbor, about a bookshop on Barrington Street that Wren had frequented during her time in the city. The Earl said he had not been inside a bookshop in 3 years. Wren told him this was a serious personal failing. He looked briefly startled and then, unexpectedly, not quite smiled. It was, she thought, a very good almost smile. She filed it away. They rode back to Caldwell House in the afternoon, arriving as the light through the birch trees was going long and gold. Wren was tired in a way that went past the body into something deeper, the tiredness of sustained effort finally permitted to ease. She was thinking of the narrow bed in her room, of sleeping, of nothing requiring calculation, when they came through the rear entrance and found Mrs. Penhaligon in the hall with an expression that stopped Wren entirely. "My lord," Mrs. Penhaligon said, then carefully to Wren, "Miss Ashby," the way she said it was wrong. "What has happened?" the Earl said. Mrs. Penhaligon looked between them. "Mr. Ashby," she said. "Before he departed this morning, he spoke with the Countess at some length." She paused. "The Countess has been made to understand certain things about Miss Ashby's character and intentions. She has—" Another pause, the pause of a woman delivering a message she personally objects to. "She has requested that Miss Ashby's employment be terminated, and that she leave before dinner." The hall was quiet. Wren looked at the floor of the hall. The same stone floor, the same pattern, the same faint mark near the south wall where a large press had stood for years and left its impression. She had played near that mark as a child. She looked at the Earl. His face was controlled. The neutral face, the one she had catalogued in the first days. But underneath it, something was happening that the neutrality was working to contain. He said nothing. He did not say, "She is not the house assistant, she is the owner." He did not say, "We have just filed a claim that makes this conversation meaningless." He said nothing, and Wren understood. In the way one understands things that arrive whole and sudden, that his mother's wishes sat on him, with a weight she had not fully accounted for, that whatever had been said to Lady Emmeline had arrived in prepared ground, that the man who had ridden through the night and signed his name beside hers and almost smiled over halibut was now standing his entrance hall between his mother's instruction and his own conscience, and he had not yet moved. The silence stretched. Wren made the decision for him. "Thank you, Mrs. Penhaligon," she said. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. "I'll be packed within." "The hour, Miss Ashby," the Earl said. "It's quite all right," she said. She did not look at him. "I have everything I came for." She walked past Mrs. Penhaligon, past the low table by the door, past the portrait wrapped in its cloth at the top of the stair. She walked to her room and closed the door, and stood in the middle of it with her coat still on and the envelope still against her ribs. She allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she opened her bag and began to fold things into it. She was methodical. She was always methodical. The hands must be kept busy when the mind cannot afford to be. She had nearly finished when she noticed the apple on the writing table, the Cox's orange from Mr. Solly. It was past its best now, beginning to go soft at one side. She looked at it. She left it where it was. She took one sheet of paper from the writing case, sat at the table, and wrote. She wrote for several minutes in the careful hand her father had taught her. She did not seal the letter. She placed it on the table and picked up her bag and left the room without looking back. She carried the bag down herself. Mrs. Penhaligon moved to assist her. Wren shook her head gently. Mrs. Tavish appeared in the kitchen doorway, and her face, when she saw the bag, did something complicated and painful. Wren looked at her and gave the smallest shake of her head, the same message she had given Mr. Solly on the second morning. Not yet. But it's coming. She asked the footman to arrange for the cart to Harwick. She stood in the entrance hall and waited. The Earl came down the stair. He came down with the look of a man who has made a decision and is not at peace with it, and is coming to deliver it regardless. Wren watched him descend and thought, there it is. She had wondered since very early on. She had told herself it did not matter. She had been disciplined about it. But she had wondered. He reached the bottom. He looked at her bag. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. Please don't, Wren said quietly. He closed it. Whatever you intend to say, I would prefer you didn't. I am tired, and I have the document, and the claim is filed, and I will be fine. She paused. I have always been fine. She picked up her bag and walked out the front door of Caldwell House into the late afternoon. She did not look back at the house as the cart moved away through the birch trees. She looked straight ahead. She held the envelope against her ribs with one hand, and with the other she held the edge of the seat. She breathed. On the writing table in the small room behind her, the letter sat open and unread. She did not know when he would find it. She did not know what he would do when he did. She was very tired. She had done everything correctly. The house was hers on paper and in law, and by morning it would begin to be hers in fact. And none of that changed the particular feeling in her chest as the cart moved away through the birch trees, and the last of the afternoon light came gold and long across the Caldwell fields. She had not let herself want this, she realized. Not the house. She had always wanted the house, had been honest with herself about that. But this other thing she had not given herself permission to name. She had planned and calculated and held herself apart from it with meticulous discipline. She watched the road ahead and did not let herself think about the expression on his face at the bottom of the stair. Behind her, in the room she had left, the letter said, "My lord, the document room key is with Mrs. Penhaligon. I borrowed it twice. She may have noticed. I thought you should know in any case. The orchard needs tending before winter, Mr. Solly knows exactly which trees want attention if anyone wishes to ask him. He has been waiting to be asked. The portrait in the gallery is my mother. Her name was Sylvie Ashby, born Mercier. She was 24 when that portrait was made, and wearing the ivory dress because my father asked her to wear it, and she never could say no to a request made gently. I would like it uncovered when the house is mine again. I would like it to stay in the gallery where the afternoon light finds it. I do not write this to make you feel anything in particular. I write it because these things should be known by whoever lives in this house, and you have lived in it, and perhaps you will remember. Thank you for Halifax. I mean that without any qualification at all. Wren Ashby." The Earl read it, standing at the writing table in the small room that smelled faintly of apples. He had come looking for her 40 minutes after the cart left. He had stood in the entrance hall for 20 of those minutes, saying nothing to anyone, and then had gone upstairs with the particular set of a man who has made a decision and wants to reach it before he can talk himself out of it. He read the letter twice. He stood at the window and looked at the kitchen garden below in the evening light. He looked at the apple on the writing table, gone soft at one side, left behind. He thought about a woman who had arrived with a single bag, and a stone turned inward and had emptied his ash bucket and said nothing and waited with a patience he was only now truly understanding the depth of for the truth to have room to exist. He thought about what he had done at the bottom of the stair. He had done nothing. He had stood there and watched her pick up her bag and walk out the door of her own house, and he had said nothing. And he had told himself there were reasons. His mother's distress was real. The situation needed time. The legal matter was resolved. She was protected. And all of those things were true, and none of them were the reason. The reason was that the moment at the bottom of the stair had not been a practical problem. It had been a choice. His mother's expectation or the particular expression on Wren Ashby's face, and he had stood there and let the moment pass. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. He went downstairs and found his mother in the east sitting room with her embroidery. She looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman expecting to be confirmed in a decision. "James," she said. She had always called him James despite the earldom. "I think it was for the best." Lachlan explained her history quite clearly, and I really do feel. Lachlan Ashby is not a reliable authority on Wren Ashby's history, the Earl said. He is a man who has spent 4 years fabricating that history in order to take possession of an estate that belongs to his niece. He came to this house to prevent her from reclaiming it. He used you to do it. Lady Emmeline stared at him. "This morning," he continued, "I sat in a solicitor's office in Halifax and watched Wren Ashby file a legally executed claim on a will her father prepared with meticulous care specifically, because he knew men like his brother would try exactly what his brother tried. The claim is filed. The estate is hers. It has always been hers, and we have been living in it." The silence in the sitting room was considerable. Lady Emmeline set down her embroidery. The expression of a woman doing very uncomfortable revision moved across her face. To her credit, she sat with it. She did not protest immediately. "She never said a word," she said at last, almost wondering. "In all the time she was here. She simply—" "No," the Earl said. "She didn't." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "She was very good with my nerves." A pause. She listened. "Most people don't actually listen." "I know. Where is she now? That," the Earl said, "is what I am about to address." He went to find Mrs. Penhaligon, who was not a woman who dissembled, and told him directly that Miss Ashby had taken the cart to the coaching inn at Harwick, that she had left approximately 2 hours ago, and that from there she would presumably take the evening stage south. "How long does the stage wait at Harwick on a Thursday?" the Earl asked. Mrs. Penhaligon considered. "Thursdays they wait for the Truro connection. Stage is usually late." "Have Ember saddled," the Earl said. He was in the stable yard 10 minutes later when Mr. Solly appeared from the kitchen garden side. The old man looked at the Earl with an assessment so absolute and neutral it reminded him, sharply and with sudden clarity, of Wren's own face. The same quality, the same depth behind it. "She took the cart to Harwick," the Earl said, 2 hours ago. "How long does the Thursday stage wait?" Mr. Solly looked at him for a moment. "Depends. Thursdays usually long." He paused. "She liked to ride fast." "I know," the Earl said. He mounted. He looked down at Mr. Solly. "The orchard," he said. "She wants it tended before winter, her mother's way." Mr. Solly looked up at him. Something in the old man's face shifted. Not surprise, but the look of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is watching that patience, at last, bear fruit. "I know how it's meant to be done," he said quietly. "Been waiting for someone to ask." The Earl nodded and rode. He rode hard. The road to Harwick was 5 miles, and he took them in the dark with the focused urgency of a man who has identified exactly what he should have done 3 hours ago and is making up the distance. The night was clear. The road was dry. What he intended to say when he arrived was considerably less clear, and he set that problem aside on the grounds that some things could not be prepared for. The coaching inn at Harwick was lit and warm, and the stage was still in the yard. He could see it from the road. He pulled up and dismounted and went in. The front room was low-ceilinged and full of the smell of wood smoke and old things, and people who had been traveling since early morning. He scanned it with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly who he is looking for. She was in the far corner. She had a cup in front of her. Her traveling bag was beside her chair. She was not reading. She was sitting with the stillness she always had, looking at nothing particular, and she had not yet seen him. He crossed the room. She looked up when he was close, and her face, her composed, patient, entirely controlled face, did something it had not done in all the time he had observed it. The composure came undone, slightly, just slightly, and what was underneath it for one unguarded moment he felt in his chest with an accuracy that left no room for interpretation. She recovered. Of course she did. "My lord," she said. Her voice was even. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was not particularly appropriate to his station, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table, which was also not, and looked at her directly, because he had ridden 5 miles in the dark specifically for that purpose, and he was not going to be oblique about it. "I stood at the bottom of the stair," he said, and said nothing. Wren said nothing. "That was wrong," he said. "The claim is filed. You are protected. Those things are true. But it was wrong. You walked out of your own house with your own bag, and I stood there, and I had reasons, and they felt like reasons at the time, and they were the habits of a man who manages things from a careful distance and calls it prudence." He paused. "They were not reasons. They were the absence of one." Wren looked at him across the table. Outside, the stage horses shifted in the yard. The room moved around them with its noise and warmth and complete indifference. "Your mother," she began, "knows," he said. "I told her everything." "She is." He paused, revising. "She has good instincts when they haven't been worked on, and she is considerably more angry at Wren Ashby for using her than she is at me for the situation, which I think is accurate of her. A beat. She also said you were very good with her nerves." Something moved at the corner of Wren's mouth. "The legal proceedings will begin next week," he continued. "Your uncle will file a counterclaim. Mr. Dodd estimates 6 to 8 weeks for the formal resolution. During that time, the estate remains in a complicated position." He held her gaze. "I would like you to come back to Caldwell House, not as house assistant, not as staff, as its owner, while the proceedings resolve." Wren looked at him. "There is something else," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a document, not the will, not the solicitor's letter, smaller, older. The paper yellowed, the ink faded to brown but legible. "I found this in my predecessor's papers when I inherited," he said. "I read it and did not understand it at the time and set it aside. I understand it now." He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. "I think it was meant for you." Wren picked it up. The handwriting at the top was her father's. She recognized it before she read the salutation. Her father had written to the previous Earl of Caldwell, years before the illness, before any of it. A letter between two men who had known each other as neighbors and trusted each other in the quiet way of men who do not declare things. The letter asked one thing: "If something should happen to me, and Wren is alone, watch for her if you can." She will not ask. She never asks. But she will need someone to see past the not asking. Wren read it to the end. She held it for a moment. She set it down between them. She looked at him. "He knew your father," she said. "Apparently," said the Earl, "better than either of us knew." A silence. "You said—" He stopped, started again. "In the library you said you needed to know what kind of man I was before you gave me the power to destroy you." "Yes," Wren said. "And do you know?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the coachman was calling the final board. Neither of them moved. "I think," Wren said slowly, "that you are a man who rides 5 miles in the dark to a coaching inn because he stood at the bottom of a stair and said nothing, and could not let that be the last thing." The Earl held her gaze. "That is very specific." "I am a very observant person," Wren said. The coachman called again. Wren looked at her bag. She looked at the door. She looked at the man across the table, who had ridden through one night for a legal document and through another night for an entirely different reason, and who was looking at her now with the expression she had catalogued and not recatalogued, and finally, in this moment, stopped trying to categorize, because some things did not need a category. They only needed to be true. "The portrait," she said. "In the gallery. It will be uncovered before you return," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. Then she reached and picked up her father's letter from the table and held it a moment and placed it carefully inside her coat, against the envelope where it had always belonged. "I'll need a moment to speak to the coachman," she said. "Take whatever time you need," he said. She stood and went to the door and told the coachman she would not be on the stage after all. She came back. She picked up her bag. She looked at the Earl, who had also risen, and who was looking at her with the expression she had finally decided to name. She had earned the right. He was looking at her the way her father had looked at her mother in the portrait, the way a man looks when he has stopped pretending he isn't. "Well then," Wren said. "Well then," said the Earl. They walked out of the coaching inn together into the clear November night, and the sky above Harwich was enormous and cold and full of stars, and the road back to Caldwell House stretched before them pale and certain in the dark. He helped her up. His hands were steady, so were hers. They rode. 1 year later, Caldwell House in autumn was a particular kind of beautiful. Wren had always known this, had carried the memory of it through 2 years in Halifax and 1 winter in a house that smelled of other people's lives. But knowing a thing and living inside it were different, and she had learned, in the year since she had ridden back through the birch trees on a Thursday night with the stars overhead, to let herself live inside it. Without the old guardedness, without the habit of holding good things at a slight distance in case they proved temporary. They had not proved temporary. The legal proceedings had taken 9 weeks. Wren Ashby had challenged everything. The will's execution, the witness attestation, the filing date, the health of the notary who had originally registered it. Mr. Dodd had addressed each challenge with the unhurried precision of a man who had been preparing for exactly this opposition for considerably longer than Wren Ashby had been mounting it. The Earl's testimony had been, as he had said, in the solicitor's office on Argyle Street, not easily dismissed. The estate was formally returned to Wren Ashby on a Tuesday morning in late December. Mr. Dodd had sent a letter. She had read it at the dining room table, the proper dining room, where she had been taking her meals since the morning after her return, and set it down and looked at the window for a long moment before she could speak. Lady Emmeline, who had taken to joining Wren for breakfast most mornings, on the grounds that it settled her nerves better than anything else she had tried, looked at her face and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," Wren said. Lady Emmeline had reached across the table and taken her hand, briefly and warmly, in the way of a woman who had completed an uncomfortable revision and arrived, several weeks prior, at a genuine fondness on the other side of it. The apology had come as predicted, through several indirect conversations before landing directly, involving a lengthy meditation on men who smile too readily, and then one morning over tea a quiet and plain, "I am sorry, my dear. I was made a fool of and you paid for it. That was wrong." Wren had accepted it without ceremony, and they had both been relieved to move on. Wren Ashby had left the county before the proceedings concluded. No one had seen him since. His name was not spoken at Caldwell House, which was not a rule, and was universally observed. The proceedings had also, in their final weeks, surfaced irregularities in his management of the estate finances over 4 years. These had been referred quietly to the appropriate parties and were now someone else's problem. Wren had noted it and moved forward, which was what she did. What she had not moved forward from, what she had moved steadily and deliberately toward at the pace that seemed to suit both of them, neither rushing nor retreating, was the Earl. Aldrich, she had started thinking of him by his given name sometime in the 3rd week after her return. She had not told him this. He had started calling her Wren. Just Wren. No Miss Ashby around the same time. Neither of them had remarked on it, which she thought was characteristic of both of them and probably efficient. They had talked. This was, she had come to understand, the central fact of it. Not the legal resolution, not the opinion of the county, which had been surprised and then rapidly accepting in the way counties are when an earl makes his position clear. They had talked, at length, over many evenings in the library and in the orchard, and sometimes on horseback along the eastern boundary, where the fields were long and the conversation had room. He had told her about the engagement that had ended, a woman named Harriet Frome, who had not waited and whom he did not blame, he said, though it had taken him some time to reach that conclusion. He had told her about Edinburgh and the quietness that had come back with him, which his mother found worrying, and which he described as recalibration, the particular feeling of a life that fitted differently than it had before he left. She had told him about Halifax, about the rented rooms and the work she had done, and the 2 years of preparing for something, without knowing exactly when it would become possible. About her father, the real man, not the legal name on a document, who had been gentle and precise, and had loved the orchard in the early morning, and had taught her that patience is not the same thing as passivity, that waiting with intention is its own form of action. He had listened. She had already known he could listen. But there was a difference between observing a quality in a person and having them turn it toward you, and the difference had mattered very much. He had asked her, in November, standing in the library with the directness that she had come to understand was his form of gentleness, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He did not say, "You own the house, and I have become inconveniently attached to you, and this is the logical extension," he said. "I have been trying to imagine this library without you in it, and I find I cannot do it, and I would rather know what you think that means than spend another winter being sensible about it." Wren had looked at him across her father's library, their library, the room where she had learned to read, where the bottom shelves were still arranged at child height and always would be, and thought about 11 rooms and one orchard and one man who had handed her an ash bucket and looked straight past her, and one man standing across from her who had not looked past her since approximately the 4th day. She had said yes, simply, the way she said things she meant. Now it was autumn, a year from her arrival, and Caldwell House was full of particular golden light. The portrait of her mother hung uncovered in the gallery, as it had since the night Wren had ridden back from Harwick. The afternoon reached it at 4 o'clock and made the ivory dress warm and particular, and Wren stopped to look at it most days as she passed. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she said things she did not say aloud to anyone else. Her mother had been 24 in the portrait, younger than Wren was now, and she was wearing the ivory dress because Wren's father had asked gently, and she had never been able to say no to a gentle request. Wren understood this differently now. The orchard had been tended before winter by Mr. Solly in the way he knew from long practice and long memory, and it had come back in September with the unreasonable abundance of things properly cared for after years of being merely maintained. Wren had stood at the kitchen window the morning she first saw the trees fully laden and felt something complete itself that had been incomplete for a very long time. Mrs. Tavish still gave her the good tea. This had simply become the nature of things. Mrs. Penhaligon remained professionally reliable, and had accepted the change in the household's arrangement with the equanimity of a woman who had suspected for some time that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, and was not at all surprised to have been proven right. On a morning in late October, a year and some weeks from the morning Wren Ashby had stepped out of a borrowed carriage and arrived at her family's house for the first time in 4 years. She sat on the bench in the kitchen garden as the light came low through the birch trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth and the faint sweetness of fallen apples. Aldrich came and sat beside her. He did not speak immediately. This was one of his better qualities, the ability to sit in a place without immediately requiring it to produce something. After a while, he said, "Mr. Solly says the east wall wants repointing before the frost." "I know," Wren said. "I told him to go ahead last week. He was waiting for me to say so." Aldrich was quiet a moment. "You've been telling this house what it needs since you were a child." "7," Wren said. "I was 7 the first time I told my father the kitchen garden gate hung wrong." She paused. "He fixed it the same afternoon. He always listened." Aldrich looked at her. She looked at the trees, at the late apple light coming through them, at the orchard her mother had planted the summer she was expecting Wren, which had survived 4 years of indifferent management and had come back this autumn, better than it had ever been. She was done being careful about good things. She had been patient for a long time. She had been patient and deliberate and meticulous, and she had earned the right to simply be here, in the morning, with the wood smoke and the apples and the man beside her, whose hands were folded on his knee, and who was, in all the ways that mattered, entirely hers. She reached over and took his hand. He turned it and held hers without remark, the way he did the things that were certain, quietly, completely, without any intention of letting go. In the entrance hall, on the narrow table by the door, in a small glass case that Aldrich had commissioned from a craftsman in the village, and installed himself on a Sunday afternoon without telling Wren what it was, until she came downstairs and found it. An ash bucket sat on a square of dark cloth, the same one. He had not cleaned it, guests always asked. There was something about a display case in an entrance hall that compelled inquiry, something about the evident deliberateness of it that suggested a story was there to be found. And there was always someone at every dinner who could not resist asking. Wren always answered. She told it simply, the way her father had taught her to tell things, without embellishment, without false modesty, without the performance of either. She told it the way it had been, a woman who arrived in her own house without announcing herself, who picked up a bucket and said nothing and waited, because she had learned that some truths needed time and space and the right witness before they could exist properly in the world. She told it, and people listened, and at the bucket there was always a moment of delighted outrage, and at the document room there was always a held breath, and at the coaching inn in Harwick there was always something in the room that couldn't quite be named. Aldrich listened every time. He had heard it perhaps a dozen times now. He stood at the edge of every room where she told it with the expression she no longer catalogued. When she reached the coaching inn, he always looked at her. She always looked back. He told his version occasionally, shorter, more efficient. It ended with, "I stood at the bottom of the stair and said nothing. Then I got on a horse." He said this with the self-deprecation of a man who has made peace with a specific failure and considers the peace honestly earned. Wren always said he rode 5 miles in the dark on a Thursday, and I would like that noted. It was always noted. And in the East Gallery of Caldwell House in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, when the light came gold and long across the floor and reached the portrait on the south wall, Sylvie Ashby looked out from the ivory dress her husband had asked her to wear, because he had asked gently, and she had never been able to say no to a gentle request. And the house around her was full of the particular warmth of a place that has been returned to itself, and the garden was in, and the orchard was bearing, and her daughter was exactly where she had always belonged.